Well, I'm really grateful to Professor Ebeling for really helping us understand the intellectual framework of non-interventionism. I think it was perfect timing to really lay out what it means philosophically and intellectually. And I'm actually happy because it helps me, because I want to talk about some more practical aspects of it, some real-world aspects of it. So it works well. But I should start by saying, it's funny, last April, we did a conference with the Mises Institute, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. We did a conference in April down in Lake Jackson, of all places. And just a couple of days before the conference started, President Trump decided to lob a few missiles into Syria over an alleged chemical weapons attack, gas attack on his people. So when Bumper called up and said, we should do a conference, let's do it in April, I thought, I don't know. And then here we go. Just a couple of weeks after President Trump lobbed some missiles into Syria, here we are meeting again. So I'm making a vow I will never have another April conference because I care too much about the poor Syrians. So there's one thing that I always do at conferences, and I don't know, maybe people find it annoying, but I find, because I'm really driven by the news cycle, that it helps us sort of center ourselves where we are right now, where we stand, what's happening in the world. And what I do is I just simply read the headlines from one of my favorite sites, which you all know, antiwar.com. And these are just a few of their headlines. And just to kind of put us where we are, this is what's happening this morning. Korea's agree to work toward peace, no nukes. Full text of joint declaration issued at Inter-Korean Summit. Trump encouraged by Korea Summit, upbeat about meeting Kim. Mattis, French special forces aiding U.S. in Syria. U.S. and Turkey agree to work toward deal on Manbij, it's in Syria. Pompeo says Trump, quote, unlikely to stay in Iran deal. Mattis defends Iran deal as Trump mulls withdrawing. Israel forces kill 3 Gaza border protesters, wound 600. CIA director nominee will promise not to resume torture. Okay. Trump threatens allies who oppose U.S. World Cup bid. So that's where we are this morning. We should just sort of keep up with those things, and that gives you sort of the gamut of what's happening. Now, I almost called up Jacob yesterday because I was in the depths of despair. I almost called him up and said, we need to call this conference off. Because I put on Zero Hedge, and here is the headline. Most popular politician in America. 63% have a positive view of this person, according to Quinnipiac University. South Carolina's own Nikki Haley. So you know where the neocons are going for 2020. They just can't wait to get her in. And someone wrote to me once, they said, we're so fortunate down here in South Carolina to be rid of her. Unfortunately, the U.S. is stuck with her. So, but what I'm going to talk about today is sort of a derivative of what Professor Ebeling talked about, and that is the idea of war propaganda and the manipulation of language to promote war propaganda. And I've called my talk, and I like the title, War Propaganda, the Mother of All Wars. And I think that's really true. I think of war propaganda as an intelligence official might call it, or military official might call it, the intelligence preparation of battlefield. Propaganda, manipulation of the way we use language about other nations prepares us mentally, prepares people mentally for war. So it's very, very important, and that's the reason that the neocons very early on try to manipulate the way we talk about countries. So what I'm going to do is go through sort of a general introduction on how this works, and then I'm going to go through just a few of the recent wars. I'm going to be very brief, but how propaganda, how the manipulation of language, operates in there. So the first thing about language manipulation, and I'm not going to use any names because the 2 examples I'm telling you are people that I do respect very much, and I would hate to use their names, but I think it's very illustrative of what we're trying to say. One very prominent progressive, you would all know the name, no question about it, a very good writer, widely viewed as anti-war, and I still read this person very much. But in response to the recent alleged gas attack in Douma in Syria, his response was to the effect of, and this is through Twitter, Assad is a monster who probably gassed his own people, but I don't support U.S. action against him. That's problematic because you concede a lot of the language that the neocons use, a lot of the language that the war machine uses. Well, he probably did it. It prepares people mentally and intellectually for what follows. And the other is a prominent libertarian intellectual who, again, I won't name because this person I have a lot of respect for, but we had a bit of a dust-up recently because of the issue of North Korea. And there seems to be this idea that when discussing North Korea, maybe it's changed over the last couple of days, but you have to begin with, oh, it's an absolute prison state. People are dying and eating grass and eating each other. It's the worst state in the history of the world. You have to use that before you can say, but we shouldn't do anything about it. And whether it's true or not, none of us know. We have not been there. We don't live there. We don't know what it's like. Knowing what we do know about planned economies, it probably leaves a lot to be desired. But conceding the idea that all of these terrible things have happened, but we shouldn't do anything about it, it opens the door for a criticism that you just don't care, or that there's something wrong with you if you believe this person is gassing his people, if you believe it's the worst state in the history of the world. This individual sent me and said, well, would we not be allowed to denounce the Great Terror, the crimes of communism? Why should we not preface our statements about North Korea with these kinds of comments? And I always remember what Lew Rockwell says in these situations, a great libertarian orator and intellectual. He says, is whoever the enemy of the day is he a monster? Yeah, he's a politician. He's definitely a monster. But I refuse to participate in the regime, in the neocon, in the interventionist demonization of the enemy of the week, of the enemy of the day. I refuse to participate in it. I refuse to adopt the language they want me to adopt to help the neocons push their propaganda. So I think it's very important, the use of language in propaganda. Now, Professor Ebeling was very interesting when he talked about how the one nation perceived strong attacking a weak nation and how that motivates us. We don't like seeing that the underdog is under threat. It motivates us to want to have action, and that's what the neocons, of course, and the interventionists prey on. Oh, poor such and such. How can we stand by and watch that? But a lot of this is deception, acts of deception and perception management. The first instance I want to talk about is Gulf War I. A couple of very interesting, and many of you I do already know about this, but in the lead up to Gulf War I, Representative Tom Lantos, the late Tom Lantos, the liberal interventionist from California, he held hearings on Capitol Hill. And he brought in, as many of you know, a witness, a Kuwaiti witness, who told the Congressional Human Rights Committee, remember those words, human rights, because there's another deception. The Congressional Human Rights Committee, that Saddam Hussein's troops were throwing babies from incubators and leaving them to die on the ground. She was tearful when she told the story, and it motivated members of Congress. It enraged members of Congress, and it was used by those who wanted war against Iraq. It was used to get people on board, to come over the hump from being opposed to war, which most Americans naturally are, and going into the other camp. Well, as we know now, Naira was her name, and she was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador. She was set up by Hill & Knowlton, a huge public relations firm. Tom Lantos knew who she was, but he did not tell his fellow colleagues about it. He did not tell the other members of Congress that she was the daughter of the ambassador. He knew he was setting up a deception to convey the sense that a big, mean, nasty country was beating up on a little country because he wanted war and he wasn't afraid to lie about it. Well, what happened with Lantos? Well, he also had a Congressional Human Rights Foundation. The Human Rights Committee was part of Congress, so they couldn't receive donations, but he also had a little foundation on the side, interestingly enough. And this is from the New York Times article back in '92 when they exposed what happened. They had subsidized rent at the headquarters of Hill & Knowlton down in D.C. That's interesting. Nice digs. And when the war finally broke out, Lantos' little foundation received $50,000 from the Kuwaiti government. Interesting, interesting. Second little vignette from Gulf War I, the baby milk factory. Many of you remember that as well. Peter Arnett from CNN visited after the U.S. bombed a facility that it claimed was chemical weapons. The Iraqis said it's a baby milk factory. Everyone laughed, haha, Saddam, he's so crazy, so dangerous, he's lying, it's so obvious. Peter Arnett goes down there, he reports from the scene. This is going to seem familiar to a lot of you when we get to Syria. He reports from the scene, so I looked around everywhere, it kind of looks like a baby milk factory. They may have been doing other things there that I don't know about, but it really kind of looks like it's a baby milk factory. So what happened? He was brutally attacked. Some of you remember Marlon Fitzwater. He was one of the early person who was paid to lie regularly. He was a spokesperson for the president. He said, Peter Arnett's reporting about this is really not helpful to the U.S. government. And he says, he's playing into the hands of Saddam Hussein. That's what he said about. So going there and revealing this, revealing that we actually did bomb, and as we know now, as it turns out, as the years have passed, it indeed was that. And not only did we bomb that, we bombed all of the infrastructure of Iraq. We bombed the sewage treatment facilities, so on and so on, to the point where we have the famous scene of Madeleine Albright talking about how the deaths of so many children were worth it. We intentionally, we didn't do it. I made a mistake. The U.S. government did it. So that's deception and propaganda to get people toward war. Now let's move on to the Iraq War 2.0, 2002, 2003. And I just want to talk about a little part of the deception because we could probably spend an hour or so talking about the deception. But let's talk about quote-unquote public diplomacy. That was such a key figure in the run-up to the war. Remember back at the time, the State Department hired Charlotte Beers to be its Undersecretary of State for Perception Management, Public Diplomacy. Who was she? Was she an expert in diplomacy, foreign affairs? Did she have a master's in international relations? No. She was known as, quote, the Queen of Madison Avenue. We laughed about it at the time. She sold Uncle Ben's rice. She sold Head & Shoulders shampoo to people. That was her job. Her job was to let you know that if you got dandruff, you got to buy this shampoo. That's what she did. And she went and she used those skills that she developed on Madison Avenue and the advertising agency, the PR agencies, to package and sell a war to people. She was the head of Ogilvy and Mather, one of the biggest PR firms, and J. Walter Thompson. She sold the war like shampoo to the American people. And at the same time, over at the Pentagon, we saw the emergence of Victoria Clark, a Hill and Knowlton executive. She was also in charge of PR and public perception management for the Pentagon side. What did she do? She brought in a group of regular meeting PR experts to figure out how do we sell this war? How do we keep the American people from questioning or seeing the effects of this war? This is what they did. You all remember John Rendon and the Rendon Group. He was a big PR person, big PR company in the Beltway. He literally created the Iraqi National Congress. They decided, Ahmad Chalabi, you're our guy. This is it. And so they went and they created a government for Iraq out of thin air. So what did Victoria Clark do back at the Pentagon that I think is so critical to what we're talking about today? She developed a system where only pro-war journalists could cover the war. They called it embedding the journalists. They were not going to let anyone go on a Pentagon trip, at least not more than once, if when they came back they reported that the whole thing was a disaster. So she was one of the founders of the idea that only the people who were in favor of the war could cover the war. So what did we get? We got good news stories. How many times until later on, it wasn't until later on that we saw the highway of death, we saw the charred bodies of the soldiers trying to flee, not trying to fight. So she prevented that from happening. Okay, let's go to Libya now. Honest show of hands. If there is one, I'm going to be really surprised. It'll ruin my whole thing, so don't raise your hand. Whoever's heard the name Solomon Boishwiger? Good, nobody raised their hand. Okay, he was the head of the Libyan League for Human Rights. There's that word again. It was a UN NGO, an NGO that's tied with the United Nations. They all work together. What did he do? He put a petition together to the UN Human Rights Council. This is a grouping of NGOs. He had 70 NGOs sign it. And in that petition to the Human Rights Council, he claimed that Gaddafi had killed 6,000 people, was murdering people willy-nilly, destroying his own population. This guy has got to be stopped. He invoked the horrible, horrible policy of responsibility to protect, which is really the last nail in the coffin of anything good about the United Nations. This was a sovereignty-violating idea. So 70 NGOs signed it. They said, how'd you get them to do this? Well, we're all real close, so it was really easy. After he did that, Libya was suspended from the Human Rights Council. And because they were suspended, and on the strength of that petition, the issue was referred to the United Nations Security Council, the UNSC, which can invoke an Article 7 resolution. Article 7 allows for the use of force. And that's exactly what happened. As we remember, it wasn't that long ago. UNSC Resolution 1973 established the no-fly zones. Really was the last nail in the coffin, was an open door for the U.S. and its NATO allies, bombs away. Well, interestingly enough, afterwards, a French filmmaker called Julien Thiel, who was a really fascinating guy you haven't heard of. I've met him, and he's an interesting and wonderful guy. He went back and talked to Solomon. Ask him about this. What is with this petition? How did you do it? How did you quantify these claims that you made in the petition? He said, we got all our evidence from the rebels. They told us all this stuff. That sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it, going back to Syria? And he pushed him on, you could see it on camera. I think it's probably still available on YouTube, the film. He said, well, how did you get the evidence for this? How did you get the evidence? And Solomon, this guy became a little bit aggressive. He said, there is no evidence. So here you have it, a horrific war that the Libyans are still suffering from. It's all based on lies and propaganda, and this is just one aspect of it. And now we're finding out, of course, that a lot of the war was because Sarkozy was trying to cover up the fact that Gaddafi had given him a few $million for his campaign. So let's kind of fast forwarding now to Syria, and let's just focus on the two gas attacks. Although we should know that Syria was a regime change target. You could say 2006. I've seen 1985. There's plenty of stuff. I like 2006 because we've seen the WikiLeaks cable from the U.S. Embassy in Damascus, where the U.S. political officer reported back to Main State in Washington, here is how we can do a regime change against Assad. This is 2006. Interestingly enough, right around the time that Syria was on a charm offensive in the U.S. And actually, I was invited by the Syrian ambassador, along with a group of congressional aides, to go to his house and have dinner and talk about how can we improve relations, what can we do, how can we do this. So this was a part of the charm offensive. So here we have this roadmap in 2006, and it was everything that we saw from 2011 on. Radicalized people in parts of Syria. Get radical Islam in there, cause them to, the most radical elements to destabilize the government, try to focus on the sectarian divisions in society and exacerbate them. That's exactly what happened. They had agreed. The battle was over. They were essentially getting on the buses. And all of a sudden, once again, Assad wakes up and says, I've got to gas some women and children. This is what we're expected to believe. In the heat of the battle, he didn't drop gas on the soldiers, on the rebels. No, he didn't do that. As they were leaving, he didn't gas the rebels. No, he didn't gas a single rebel. He just decided to gas the civilians, the women and children. And we're seeing now more and more that this narrative that we're being told is breaking down. The tale that they're telling us is breaking down. So President Trump decides to shoot over about 106 missiles, just to show who's boss, but not to do too much damage, although there are two arguments for that. I won't get into it. But we're talking about $1 billion. Add up the cost of the missiles, add up the cost of flying the airplanes, of moving the airplanes, you add up the cost of moving the fleet, of moving the ships around, you're talking about $1 billion spent that night. And you can't tell me that couldn't have been spent on better things. Finally, North Korea. Kim is crazy. The guy's a nut. We can't do business with him. He's totally unstable. He only listens to force. He only understands force. Lurid tales about life in North Korea, like we said. This is the language you have to speak in. Well, I think he's a total nut, total crazy. He likes killing his own people, but we shouldn't bomb him. This is the trap that we're seeing. No, he doesn't seem all that irrational, does he? He's been willing to negotiate. He's willing to meet. And in fact, no thanks to us, to be quite honest, they're moving quickly toward ending the war. If Dr. Paul were still here, he would probably give a lot of credit, and I think credit is due, to sports diplomacy, because I think the Olympics had a lot to do with the thaw between the two countries. Plus, I think it was something whose time had come. The election of Moon Jae-in in South Korea as someone to bring back the sunshine policy of negotiations with the North was a big help too. So what do I mean with all of this? Well, something really interesting is happening now, because we've had at the time of the early Gulf War, there was the mainstream media control over the narrative. But now they're losing control of the narrative. And now that they are losing control of the narrative, they are much more aggressively clamping down on dissent. Those of us who say what I just said, I don't believe what they claim about Syria. I don't believe it happened that way. There's nothing. You talk about motive. You talk about anything else. I don't believe. If you do that, you are a very bad person. The crackdown is very vicious. And how do they do it? Well, I would call it the military-industrial congressional think tank complex. It has a lot to do with it, and it's round and round you go, because the military defense industries fund the think tanks. You look at something like the Institute for the Study of War. It's the Kagan outfit, funded by the Raytheon, Lockheed Martin. Look at CSIS, funded by Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, et cetera, et cetera. The military companies fund the think tanks. The think tanks come up with papers saying we have to intervene. Those papers then go, of course, to Congress, where they're heavily lobbied by the military, military industry. And round you go. But you also have something that's interesting now that's happening, which is what you'd call the gongos, the government-organized, government-funded NGOs also attacking. In this, you may have heard some of these, the Atlantic Council, funded by governments and funded by NATO. They are virulently anti-Russia. They are virulently pro-conflict with Russia, and they take our tax money to propagandize us with papers talking about Russian aggression over and over again. You have the Alliance for Securing Democracy. Sounds great, except that it's headed up by Bill Kristol. And it's funded by the German Marshall Fund, which sounds like something the Germans fund, but they don't. We fund it. Our government funds it. So our government is giving money to Bill Kristol to secure democracy. And what does he do? They come up with this cockamamie scheme called Hamilton 68. And they use they won't tell us what, but some amazing technology to tell us what the Russian bots want us to think about. Think about the millions of dollars that are going to these crackpot schemes. What do they come up with? They can analyze hashtags on Twitter and tell us what the Russian bots want. Well, on Christmas Day, they told us that the Russian bots want us to be thinking about Christmas, because the #1 trending item on Twitter, believe it or not, was Christmas. Likewise, they reported a 4,000% increase in Russian bot activity after the Duma attack in Syria, because the hashtag Syria was trending. Okay? Could it not have been that we were actually talking about Syria? But it's funny, but it's not in a way, because calling someone a Russian troll or a Russian bot has consequences. For the Ron Paul Institute, it's had consequences. Back the day after Thanksgiving in 2016, an organization called Prop or Not had a front page piece in the Washington Post attacking organizations that were doing the bidding of the Russian government. 200 unpatriotic organizations that were doing Putin's bidding. Who was among them? Unbelievable. LouRockwell.com, Antiwar.com, Consortium News, The Drudge Report, the Ron Paul Institute. The conspiracy is deeper than you can imagine. It's comical in a way, but it casts kind of a shadow over your organization. If you dare criticize what your government is telling you about what's happening overseas, you're not a person who's critical of our foreign policy. You're not, as Professor Ebeling would say, against interventionism for very sound philosophical reasons. No, you're in the pay of a foreign government. You're doing the bidding of a foreign power, i.e. you're a traitor. So you're not just a guy that I disagree with, and maybe I really dislike you because I really don't like your views. No, you're something different. Traitors get shot. So it actually is very, very serious. It's very vicious. But why are they vicious like this? This is where I have a good news ending. The war party is losing control of the narrative, and I think that is fantastic news. The mainstream media is in decline, as we know, and independent media is on the rise. The Future of Freedom Foundation, Jacob Hornberger puts out fantastic pieces attacking the narrative. Other groups, Ron Paul Institute, antiwar.com, so many. People on Twitter, people in Syria on Twitter, attacking the narrative. For example, look what happened in Syria after the Duma attack, so-called attack. Robert Fisk, he's pretty much a mainstream guy, but he's on the left, and he went there and he said, I interviewed a bunch of people, nobody even knows what you're talking about. This young fellow, Pearson Sharp from One American News Network, he's a right-wing guy, young fellow. He went there, he interviewed tons of people. He took all kinds of precautions. Because they say, oh, they're just minders, they're being set up. No, he was on the street, he would grab someone, and ask him. Nobody in the town had heard of it. Even the German television station went over there and interviewed people. They're losing control of the narrative. RT, oh no, don't say those words, right? RT went over there and interviewed this young fellow, Hassam Diab. The young little boy, remember, he was in the video. He was the main evidence that the white helmets shot that this was an attack. It turns out he was called in there to the hospital. They started dousing him with water while they were videoing. And, a couple of days later, the kid said, I didn't know what was happening, And it's odd, they said, well, but it's obvious he wasn't a victim of a chemical attack because a couple of days later, he's a fine, young-looking 11-year-old boy. So it's coming apart. They cannot embed trusted journalists anymore like they could. They can't control the narrative like they could. That is where we fit in. There are too many independent sites that are too popular. People aren't taking the BS anymore. We haven't won, and I think it will get much worse before it gets better because it is getting vicious. The UK government had a horrible, the Times of London had a terrible front page article. These Assad apologists are working in academia. Basically and it was, I think, 3 or 4 professors in the UK who said they were skeptical about the official story on Duma. And they were presented in the front page of the Times as if they were, coming out denying the Holocaust or something, it was incredible. So there's a long way to go, but something very important is happening. They're losing control of the narrative, and we are gaining the upper hand. We are gaining control of the narrative. We have to be relentless. We're at the center of it. We're going to be challenged, but so is the war party going to be challenged. So I think we have to think about propaganda. We have to think about how we're being manipulated, refuse to be manipulated, and keep fighting back, keep supporting the Future of Freedom Foundation. If you like what the Ron Paul Institute does, please support the Ron Paul Institute. We have a little handout that we've given you. And again, from the bottom of my heart, I thank you all for coming out to visit with us today.